We all know that the apostles were the heroes who walked with their teacher and changed the world forever. But what if their spiritual calling was actually an act of economic suicide, trading established careers for guaranteed homelessness and public execution? They were low-status laborers who signed up for absolute ruin. In today's video, we'll talk about the brutal, non-glamorous contract the apostles actually signed, and why it truly sucked to be one in the first century. So let's not waste any time, and let's begin. Tonight, we peel back the layers of tradition and sentimentality to confront the gritty contract the original apostles actually signed. We've all seen the paintings, gentle, serene men, bathed in golden light, standing ready to receive their divine mandate. It looks so easy, so inevitable, so perfectly destined. But the reality of what those men signed up for was less a calling and more a guaranteed path to social, economic, and physical ruin in the brutal world of the Roman Empire. The first myth we must gently set aside is that of the apostle as a highly coveted religious position. The apostles weren't educated elite, or esteemed scholars, or powerful temple priests looking for a spiritual promotion. They were, overwhelmingly, low-status laborers pulled from Galilee, a region looked down upon by the sophisticated elite of Jerusalem and Rome. Think of them as the rural working class, easily dismissed and often ridiculed by those in power. When Jesus issued the famous, simple invitation, "Follow me," it wasn't a job offer. It was a severance package. In one moment, they severed their economic ties, walked away from their established trade, and effectively declared bankruptcy on their entire social existence. Consider the fishermen, like Peter and Andrew, who abandoned their boats and nets, their entire capital investment, their inherited family business, and their sole source of food security. That one decision instantly turned them from small business owners, however humble, into indigent wanderers. The tax collector, Matthew, faced an even sharper social edge. While already despised by his community for collaborating with Rome, his transition from comfortable, if corrupt, income to absolute poverty was a profound change in lifestyle. This commitment was not a step up. It was a dizzying plunge into homelessness and financial dependency. They became liabilities not only to themselves, but to anyone who dared to offer them a night's rest or a simple meal. This economic collapse guaranteed a life of constant, grinding poverty, a far cry from the opulent, successful ministries often imagined. They were promised no salaries, no pension, and no retirement plan. Their reward was deferred to an uncertain, far future kingdom. Their daily existence became a perpetual search for the next meal, the next dry patch of ground to sleep on, and the next person willing to risk giving them shelter. Beyond the financial ruin, the apostles' new association with Jesus immediately transformed them into political agitators in the eyes of the Roman authority. Judea was a volatile province, and any movement with a charismatic leader and a large, dedicated following was viewed with extreme suspicion. Rome did not tolerate potential uprisings, and any talk of a king who wasn't Caesar was treason, plain and simple. The apostles, therefore, became perpetual fugitives, operating under the shadow of the death penalty from the moment they started preaching. Every city gate they passed through, every centurion they encountered, and every public square they entered represented a potential arrest and brutal trial. Their lives were not marked by peaceful teachings, but by constant, strategic evasion and hurried, unplanned escapes. Furthermore, they lost the one vital commodity every person in the first century relied upon: security through obscurity. Their public association with a man who preached a revolutionary message meant they forfeited their right to blend in. No matter where they went, they were known, or at least suspected, and often marked men. This exposure made them targets for religious authorities, Roman spies, and common bandits who knew they might be carrying collected funds. The simple fact is that the job title apostle came pre-packaged with a promise of betrayal, imprisonment, and a highly painful public death. Tradition holds that nearly all of them died violently, often subjected to gruesome forms of martyrdom. This wasn't an unfortunate accident of the job. It was the inevitable final payment. They knew the occupational hazard was lethal, and yet they continued. When we consider the full weight of their choice, trading established trades for beggary, obscurity for public scorn, and security for a guaranteed date with a Roman executioner, the romantic sheen fades. Their decision was an act of economic suicide and political defiance that promised suffering and guaranteed zero earthly comfort. This stark reality of their commitment frames the rest of our story tonight. As we move from the difficult choice of recruitment to the utter lack of preparation for the brutal mission ahead, we will soon see how they struggled to deliver the most important message in history while lacking the necessary tools to even communicate effectively. We left the apostles having made the ultimate, irreversible decision, abandoning their livelihoods for a life of uncertainty, poverty, and political danger. Now, let's consider what they received in exchange for this ruinous commitment if they gave up everything. Surely, they were handed a meticulous plan, a well-structured training manual, or at least a few advanced theological degrees, right? The answer, in true first-century apostolic style, is a resounding and terrifying no. The second major reason being an apostle seriously sucked was the complete and utter lack of formal, structured training. Imagine being handed the keys to the most profound message in history, the foundation of a new world faith. But your only instruction is to go and tell. These men weren't enrolled in a 3-year seminary program. They had no access to the meticulously organized libraries or established doctrines that would define the church centuries later. Their education was raw, experiential, and chaotic, taking place primarily through following one unconventional teacher around dusty roads. The apostles, especially the initial group of 12, learned by the most stressful method possible: public, high-stakes trial and error. Think of trying to learn a complicated trade, like boat building or legal advocacy. But every mistake you make is in front of a volatile crowd of thousands. They were constantly dealing with the confusion of parables they didn't understand, doctrinal concepts they couldn't grasp, and instructions they frequently misinterpreted. The Gospels are riddled with their confusion, their petty arguments, and their spectacular failures to grasp the core mission. This record of their mistakes is comforting now, but in the moment, it was deeply humiliating and profoundly stressful. There was no private debriefing room, no comfortable office set for theological consultation. Any clarification session was conducted on the fly, usually within earshot of other disciples or curious onlookers. They were forced to process deeply challenging metaphysical concepts, the nature of suffering, the definition of the kingdom, the role of sacrifice, all while dealing with the immediate logistical concerns of feeding a crowd or escaping the notice of a Roman patrol. This created a constant psychological whiplash between the divine and the mundane. The sheer psychological burden of carrying the divine message while struggling with basic understanding must have been crushing. They were entrusted with truth, yet they constantly wrestled with doubt. We see this vividly in Peter's famous declarations, followed immediately by colossal failures of faith, or Thomas's stubborn demand for physical proof. They were the appointed representatives of God's new plan, yet they were deeply, obviously human, wrestling with fear, arrogance, and uncertainty. This internal conflict meant they could never truly relax. Every sermon they delivered, every miracle they performed, and every debate they engaged in carried the heavy risk of misrepresentation. A terrifying thought when the message involved eternal consequence. This problem of misinterpretation was amplified by the lack of written resources. Before the Gospels and epistles were fully compiled and circulated, a process that would take decades, the apostles were the library. Their memory was the database. Their testimony was the authoritative scripture. The weight of ensuring doctrinal purity rested entirely on fallible, overworked, and stressed human recall. The slight variation in a word, a misplaced emphasis in a story, or a detail forgotten in translation could cause a doctrinal schism centuries down the line. This responsibility was far greater than any academic stress test. Moreover, their early education ended abruptly with the arrest and death of their teacher. They were left, quite literally, leaderless and rudderless, scattered by fear and confusion. The brief, intense period of mentorship was over, and they were plunged directly into the deep end of the public eye, forced to lead and teach without the guiding presence they relied upon. The Pentecost experience provided the necessary spiritual capacity, yes, but it didn't suddenly give them years of structured education or an operational plan. It simply magnified the stakes of their chaotic, on-the-job training. They were now the senior management of a movement that had no buildings, no bylaws, no treasury, and no recognized legal status. Their mission required them to be scholars, administrators, healers, public speakers, and political strategists, all roles for which their previous lives as fishermen or tax collectors had given them zero preparation. This radical skill gap created immense stress and internal disputes, forcing them to learn bureaucracy and administration while literally running for their lives. This lack of formal structure meant the apostles were constantly playing defense, reacting to events rather than confidently leading them. They were unprepared for the inevitable questions about Jewish law, unprepared for the hostility of the Roman state, and fundamentally unprepared for the sheer scale of the mission they were given. The only certainty they had was the divine power that occasionally burst forth through them. Yet, even that power was bewildering, often bringing them more trouble than relief. They were pioneers, and pioneering always sucks. They bore the full, unmitigated cost of establishing doctrine, organization, and outreach for the very first time, without any historical precedent to guide them. It's no wonder They frequently argued and doubted. The weight of an entire civilization's spiritual future was resting on men who were still trying to figure out which end of the boat was the bow. As we transition now, we'll see how this lack of spiritual preparation was mirrored by a complete, debilitating lack of physical and material support. Having established the total lack of academic preparation, we now turn to the apostles' material situation, which only compounded their misery. The third reason being an apostle was such a brutal life was their deliberate, mandated lack of material resources. If their spiritual training was based on chaos, their logistical plan was based on abject poverty. We must reflect on the explicit instructions given to them to travel without money, without extra clothing, and without supplies. In the safety of a modern context, this sounds like a noble exercise in faith. In the first century, it was a practical death sentence. When you commit to traveling constantly, especially through the unpredictable terrain of Judea, Galilee, and later the broader Mediterranean, having provisions is not a luxury. It is the fundamental guarantee of survival. Traveling without a purse meant a guarantee of constant grinding hunger. They could not purchase basic provisions, nor could they afford shelter from the elements. They were wholly reliant on the mercy and charity of strangers, a reliance that came with immense hidden costs. They had to perpetually hope that the next village or the next hospitable house would not only accept them, but be kind enough to feed and house them. This wasn't a sustainable economic model. It was a prayer whispered over every empty stomach. Their lack of extra clothing was equally crippling. First-century clothing was not easily washed or replaced, and constant travel through dust, rain, and mud quickly turned their garments into ragged, disease-ridden liabilities. Imagine walking the length of Roman roads, sleeping in sheds or open fields, all while wearing the same tunic for weeks on end. This exposed them not only to the elements, but to constant ridicule and the scorn reserved for the lowest class of vagrants. They looked poor, they smelled poor, and they were treated accordingly. The mandate to carry nothing essentially ensured a life of crippling exposure. The weather in the Levant is dramatically varied, scorching, dehydrating desert heat by day, followed by cold, damp nights. Without a second cloak or blanket, they were constantly fighting off hypothermia, sunstroke, and the inevitable, opportunistic diseases that preyed on the constantly fatigued and malnourished. Their bodies were paying a physical tax for every mile they traveled, a debt that would only accumulate over time. This complete material lack transformed their gear from inadequate to an active, crippling vulnerability. Their only assets were their sandals, often worn thin by thousands of miles of walking, and the strength of their faith. Their physical state made them weaker targets for bandits and guaranteed they would always be viewed as beggars by established society, further eroding their credibility as messengers of a powerful, triumphant faith. How could they preach a kingdom of abundance when their clothes were threadbare and their stomachs were empty? The narrative now smoothly transitions from this lack of physical tools to the subtle social tools they were missing. In any ancient society, appearance and presentation were everything. A well-dressed man, even a simple one, commanded respect. A man who appeared indigent, especially one who spoke with conviction, was often seen as a dangerous lunatic or a desperate fraud. This inability to blend in was a critical flaw in their operational security. The medieval assassin in the reference script could at least adopt a disguise, find a hidden alley, or wear clothes appropriate to the city he was infiltrating. The apostle, however, was perpetually stuck in the uniform of the penniless Galilean wanderer. Their poverty was a visible, inescapable mark of their status, preventing them from accessing high-status circles where their message might have gained powerful patronage. They were forced to rely on the marginalized, the poor, and the social outcasts for support, which further entrenched their status as an undesirable movement. The very mechanism designed to test their faith, relying solely on God and hospitality, simultaneously guaranteed their social rejection and physical suffering. The apostles' toolkit was less a collection of functional items and more a testament to their profound, painful vulnerability, paving the way for the next social obstacle we must examine: the curse of their distinctive foreign accent. If the previous discussion detailed the miserable physical reality of the apostolic mission, this new segment now dives into the equally harsh social and psychological cost of being constant outsiders. The fourth major challenge that made the apostles' life so difficult was their inability to simply blend into the cultural landscape, largely due to where they came from and how they spoke. We must understand that first-century Judea and the Roman world were highly stratified societies where social status was immediately identifiable by dress, dialect, and bearing. The apostles, mostly Galileans, carried the indelible mark of their origin, and this region was the historical butt of jokes and condescension. Galilee was considered a rustic, backward backwater, far removed from the centers of intellectual and religious sophistication like Jerusalem or the Hellenistic cities of the diaspora. Therefore, when the apostles arrived in the temple courts of Jerusalem or the marketplaces of Antioch, their distinct Galilean accents immediately marked them as uneducated outsiders. This was more than a simple regional difference. It was a badge of inferiority that undermined their credibility before they even opened their mouths. Peter, famously, was identified during the pivotal moment of his teacher's trial, not by his association, but by his telltale accent. This single detail illustrates how inescapable their regional identity truly was. This linguistic and cultural disadvantage meant they were easy targets for suspicion, mockery, and outright dismissal, especially by the educated elite, the very people whose influence they needed to convert. Imagine a renowned Roman philosopher or a high-ranking temple official listening to a doctrine of resurrection presented by a man who sounds like a simple peasant from the sticks. The message, however profound, was often rejected simply because of the low-status vessel it came through. This constant struggle for credibility was an exhausting psychological battle. Their simple, rustic dress only amplified this problem. As previously discussed, their lack of funds forced them into the attire of vagrants. Combined with the accent, they were a walking collection of social red flags. They couldn't walk into a marketplace or a synagogue and command instant respect. They had to earn it by overcoming layers of class-based prejudice and snobbery. This hostile reception created an immediate, exhausting barrier to entry in every new city they visited. The narrative of Acts records moments where the apostles were literally mocked, accused of being drunk on new wine simply because the crowds couldn't comprehend their passionate, accented speech. This public ridicule was deeply dehumanizing and a massive setback for their mission. Every single engagement, every attempt to convey the divine, was initiated from a position of profound social weakness. Furthermore, this struggle for credibility didn't just affect their public speaking. It made their administrative and teaching tasks harder. When disputes arose within the nascent Christian communities, the apostles' lack of formal education made them vulnerable to challenges from more polished, Hellenized teachers. Paul, who possessed Roman citizenship and a formal education, constantly had to defend his authority against those who dismissed him as less legitimate than the original Jerusalem messengers. This internal schism, driven partly by class and learning, added yet another layer of stress to their lives. This constant fight for simple human respect made their revolutionary message of equality and redemption all the more difficult to deliver. They were preaching to a world obsessed with hierarchy that their fisherman-based leadership was supreme. It was a cognitive dissonance that fueled the immediate and inevitable conflict with the local authorities who feared their message. This struggle for acceptance and credibility ultimately leads directly into the violence of their persecution. Because they were seen as low-status, uneducated rabble, it was easy for established religious and civil powers to dismiss them, rally the mob against them, and execute them without recourse. They were not viewed as dangerous political rivals, but as irritating gnats to be swatted away, and that social dismissal made their violence easier to justify. The curse of the foreign accent and the simple clothes ensured that wherever they went, they were immediately identifiable, instantly judged, and perpetually on the defensive. This vulnerability made their message harder to deliver and directly paved the way for the physical conflict they constantly faced from their earliest opposition, the local synagogue. We have traced the apostles' journey from financial ruin and inadequate training to their status as social outcasts. Now, we arrive at the fifth, immediate, and inescapable threat that defined their daily life: the constant danger posed by their own local Jewish communities and the very institutions they were trying to engage. The reality that being an apostle sucked was heavily underscored by the fact that their primary persecutors were not initially the Romans, but often the very people they were trying to save. This persecution was deeply personal, painful, and inescapable, highlighting the immense courage required simply to walk into the local place of worship. The apostles' early strategy was simple: begin preaching in the local synagogue, leveraging their Jewish heritage to speak to their kin. However, this strategy carried immediate, severe risk. In the eyes of many local leaders, the apostles were not merely mistaken. They were dangerous heretics, blasphemers who threatened the sanctity of the Torah and the social stability of the Jewish community under Roman rule. This perceived threat meant the opposition they faced was often more zealous and immediate than the distant, bureaucratic violence of Rome. This segment details the physical and social harm emanating from the synagogue gate. Persecution frequently began with verbal abuse and escalating to physical assault. The book of Acts is a ledger of these events. Apostles being dragged out of synagogues, subjected to formal beatings, or being forced out of the city by angry, organized mobs. These were not random acts of street crime. They were targeted, institutionally sanctioned violence. A formal synagogue beating, known as 40 lashes minus one, was a horrific, life-threatening ordeal. It involved being tied down and whipped with rods or leather straps, a punishment that could cause permanent injury, disfigurement, or even death. For men already malnourished and fatigued from constant travel, these beatings were catastrophic. Yet, they endured them repeatedly simply for daring to speak their message in a Jewish context. Beyond the physical danger, the threat of social excommunication, being cast out of the synagogue, was nearly as devastating. In the first century, the synagogue was the hub of Jewish life, the center for worship, education, commerce, and community welfare. To be excommunicated was to be stripped of your social standing, your network, and your ability to conduct business in a community. It turned the apostles into pariahs, not just to the Romans, but to their own people, amplifying their isolation and reliance on the small, fragile house churches they founded. This persecution was inescapable because the apostles were compelled by faith to re-enter this dangerous environment repeatedly. In every new city they visited, the cycle had to begin anew. Find the synagogue, preach the gospel, face the inevitable opposition, endure the hostility, and then, often, be forced to flee under cover of darkness. This constant pattern of acceptance, followed by immediate, violent rejection, created a pervasive atmosphere of anxiety and insecurity. The personal struggle of facing your own community as an enemy, of seeing family, friends, and trusted neighbors turn into persecutors, was a psychological burden far heavier than facing a distant Roman legionary. It meant they couldn't count on safe harbor, even in places that should have been welcoming. Their own heritage became a source of profound personal pain. This hostility from within the Jewish community was also crucial, because it was often the catalyst for Roman involvement. Local Jewish leaders would frequently bypass their own power limits and report the apostles to the Roman authorities, framing the religious conflict as a political disturbance or a breach of the peace. By turning the apostles over to the empire, they effectively escalated the danger from local harassment to the full lethal machinery of the imperial state. Thus, the struggle the apostles faced at the synagogue gate was the crucible of their mission. It was intensely personal, physically damaging, and socially isolating, and it led directly to the ultimate threat, the imperial state. We now see how this personal struggle with local opposition inevitably paved the path for the greater, colder, and more organized threat of the Roman Empire itself. The struggle at the synagogue gate, as detailed in the previous segment, was intensely personal and often physically painful. But it was merely a localized skirmish compared to the vast, cold war that was brewing with the Roman Empire. The sixth major reason why the apostolic mission was so deeply miserable was that they were not merely viewed as religious heretics. They were seen by the largest, most efficient bureaucratic and military machine in the world as political agitators and members of an illegal foreign cult. This perception instantly transformed every apostle into a fugitive. The Roman perspective was chillingly simple. They didn't care about the theological distinction between Judaism and this new messianic sect. Rome cared about order, taxes, and the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The apostles, by preaching a kingdom not of this world, were implicitly undermining the one king who mattered: Caesar. Any large, itinerant group gathering crowds and speaking of a new sovereign was, by default, a disturber of the peace, a liability to the local governor, and a threat to imperial authority. This political classification meant that Roman persecution was not driven by religious fanaticism, but by bureaucratic efficiency. The apostles were processed as legal, administrative problems. Local officials, keen to keep their provinces quiet and avoid attracting unwanted attention from Rome, treated the fledgling movement as a nuisance that needed to be suppressed quickly and decisively. The bureaucratic machinery of the empire that pursued them was relentless, making them perpetual fugitives with nowhere truly safe to hide. Unlike the local Jewish opposition, which was confined to certain areas and motivated by doctrine, the Roman authority was ubiquitous. Every cohort, every customs agent, every magistrate, and every governor across the vast Mediterranean world operated under the same set of laws that prohibited unregistered cults and seditious political speech. This meant that Paul or Peter might escape a beating in Jerusalem, only to be arrested for sedition in Philippi or Ephesus, hundreds of miles away, under the exact same legal pretexts. Their identity as fugitives informed every aspect of their existence, profoundly impacting their travel and escape plans. They could never stay in one place long enough to establish deep roots or build lasting communities. Their movements were dictated not by spiritual opportunity, but by strategic evasion. They were always scanning the horizon for the Roman eagle standard, always listening for the tramp of legionary boots. A sudden uproar, a single riot, or a simple accusation was enough to trigger a Roman arrest. And Roman arrests almost always ended with public humiliation, imprisonment, or a violent death. The famous Roman road system, a marvel of ancient engineering that allowed the message to spread rapidly, simultaneously served as the empire's surveillance network. These roads, so essential for rapid communication and missionary travel, were also patrolled, taxed, and monitored. When an apostle used a Roman road, they were not just traveling. They were taking a calculated risk, consciously entering a controlled environment where their status as an unregistered, impoverished Galilean wanderer made them an easy target for inquiry. The constant need for secrecy and rapid movement placed an enormous strain on the apostles' health and psychological state. They had to rely on a network of underground sympathizers moving from one safe house to the next, never truly relaxing. They had to learn the local rules of engagement, when to invoke Roman citizenship, as Paul sometimes could, when to disappear into the crowd, and when to simply endure a beating. This pressure cooker environment created a deep-seated paranoia, the constant fear of betrayal. Because Rome offered rewards for information about political agitators, any new face, any inquisitive question, or any sudden crowd could signal an informant or a trap. The initial betrayal of Judas was only the first in a long line of individuals who would turn them over to the authorities, confirming that trust was the most precious and fragile commodity they possessed. Furthermore, the legal status of the movement was ambiguous and dangerous. While Judaism held a privileged position as an ancient legal religion, the apostolic message was deemed a novel, unauthorized, and frankly, irritating offshoot. This lack of legal protection meant they could not appeal to Roman courts for justice against false accusations. They were defenseless. They were constantly fighting a battle against the imperial machine without the right to an attorney, the protection of due process, or the guarantee of a fair trial. Their only defense was the moral character of their movement, a defense which meant absolutely nothing to a Roman magistrate concerned only with maintaining order. Life as a wanted man under the Roman law meant enduring relentless psychological and physical pressure. They were forced to operate like a political insurgency, using covert communication, exploiting porous borders, and relying on the kindness of strangers in a world that rewarded conformity and punished dissent. Their success was not due to a superior logistical plan, but to their superhuman capacity to endure the constant, bureaucratic pursuit of the most powerful empire in history. This reality now leads us to consider the physical toll of their movements, the actual miserable logistics of first-century travel. If the imperial pursuit made the apostles' lives a nightmare, the physical process of actually moving between cities made their bodies a wreck. The seventh layer of misery on the apostolic contract was the simple, brutal reality of first-century travel. The high-risk logistics of covering vast distances without modern comforts or reliable security. For us, traveling 100 miles means a comfortable few hours in a climate-controlled vehicle. For the apostles, covering that same distance meant days, often weeks, of relentless physical exposure, danger, and misery. Their journeys were not picturesque strolls. They were acts of brutal physical endurance, where simply moving from point A to point B was an immense risk. Consider the Roman roads, the celebrated arteries of the empire. While well constructed, they were primarily designed for marching legions and administrative carts, not for the comfort of pedestrians, especially impoverished ones. Walking dozens of miles a day on these hard surfaces, often wearing thin sandals as the only barrier between their feet and the grinding stone, led to chronic foot injuries, blisters, and bone fatigue. The constant dust, magnified by the passage of military traffic, irritated their lungs and eyes. These roads were also inherently dangerous. Without the centralized policing we rely on, remote stretches were infested with bandits and highwaymen. The apostles, traveling without wealth but carrying the appearance of beggars, were still attractive targets. Their attackers weren't looking for gold. They were looking for their few spare garments, their food, or simply a vulnerable victim to brutalize. Every shadowed copse of trees, every twist in the road, presented a mortal threat that they had no means to defend against, having been commanded to travel without weapons. Sea travel offered no relief. It often simply traded one form of danger for another. Their voyages were undertaken in primitive, small vessels, essentially cargo ships or fishing boats, lacking navigation equipment or safety features. These ships were entirely at the mercy of sudden Mediterranean storms, capable of turning calm waters into a watery graveyard in minutes. Paul's own account of a shipwreck, where he and hundreds of others were cast adrift and fought for survival for days, was not an anomaly, but a constant potential reality for any extended voyage. Even if the weather held, the conditions on board were miserable. Crammed into the hold with hundreds of other passengers and their cargo, often livestock, grain, or other unsanitary goods, they endured filth, disease, and chronic seasickness. Fresh water and food were scarce and often spoiled. For men who were already physically weakened by constant hunger and exposure from their time on land, a sea voyage was a high-risk gamble with their lives. Disease and injury were constant companions. A simple cut or scrape, which a modern person ignores, could turn septic and become a death sentence in the first century, where antibiotics and sterilized wound care were unknown concepts. Their constant exposure, poor diet, and lack of hygiene made them susceptible to every endemic disease they encountered in crowded urban centers: typhus, dysentery, and fever. The need for healing powers in the early church was not just spiritual. It was a desperately practical response to the brutal environment they were forced to operate within. The cumulative effect of these logistical hardships was a permanent state of physical exhaustion and pain. They didn't just look poor because they were poor. They looked exhausted, sun-scorched, and prematurely aged because their bodies were constantly fighting the environment and the dangers of the road. Their ability to deliver the message, to preach with passion and clarity, was compromised daily by the sheer grinding reality of their physical circumstances. This level of risk created an absolute, unavoidable need for rest and temporary safety. When they finally did arrive at a town, the very first thing they needed was not a pulpit, but a bed, a meal, and a bath. This desperate physical need forced them into the next unavoidable vulnerability, relying on the hospitality of strangers and the illusion of the safe house. The severe physical toll exacted by first-century travel, detailed in the last segment, forced the apostles into an almost continuous state of dependency upon others. This leads us to the eighth and often overlooked source of apostolic stress, the so-called safe house. The reality of hospitality in this mission was fraught with danger, transforming the host into a potential victim and the apostle into a liability, not just a guest. We must immediately debunk the modern, comfortable idea of a secure, anonymous safe house. There was no such thing. In the tightly knit, often volatile communities of the ancient world, strangers were instantly noticeable, and their business was instantly scrutinized. A fisherman, Peter, arriving in a new city and asking for lodging would be immediately recognized as being part of the same odd, itinerant movement that had caused trouble elsewhere. Their visibility was a ticking clock. For the apostles, asking for hospitality was not merely a matter of receiving charity. It was an act of potentially placing a family into extreme peril. They were not just accepting a meal. They were exposing their hosts to the risk of mob violence, legal reprisal from local authorities, or even Roman interrogation. To host an apostle was to openly support an unregistered cult, a movement deemed seditious and financially ruinous by the Roman state and the religious establishment. This tension made every welcome complex. Was the host genuinely committed to the cause, or were they merely extending cultural hospitality that could turn to panic at the first sign of trouble? The apostle, acutely aware of the danger they brought, could never truly relax. Every creak in the night, every raised voice in the street could signal a raid, an accusation, or a betrayal that would cost the host family everything: their reputation, their freedom, or their lives. The apostles, therefore, were simultaneously guests and hostages. They were reliant on their hosts for life itself, yet their presence made those same hosts hostages to the apostles' own notoriety. This psychological dynamic created an environment of continuous strain. They had to balance the need to teach and organize the community with the necessity of maintaining absolute discretion and low visibility. Every conversation about the message, every moment of communal prayer was a calculated risk that could be overheard. This pressure also led to the inherent difficulty of the communal living arrangements. These hosts were often poor, struggling families themselves. Having an apostle, a man with no income and multiple companions, in residence was a significant financial strain. It was the equivalent of taking on several permanent non-paying boarders whose presence might get your house burned down. This financial and physical tension often led to early departures, forcing the apostles back onto the dangerous road sooner than their weary bodies desired. This precarious existence in the early Christian safe houses transitioned smoothly into the internal pressures of the burgeoning faith itself. When a community lives under constant fear, internal conflicts are inevitable. Resources are scarce, personality clashes are magnified, and the tension of waiting for the next crisis often leads to internal disputes. The strain on the host community was so great that the apostles quickly had to devise systems, like the appointment of deacons, to manage the practical, economic side of the mission, ensuring that their presence didn't accidentally starve or bankrupt their most loyal supporters. The illusion of the safe house was that it offered rest and security. The reality was that it provided a brief, anxious reprieve from the road, trading physical exhaustion for psychological fear and transferring the liability of the mission onto the shoulders of the kind souls who dared to open their doors. The need for these communities to survive and thrive without resources leads us directly to the constant, grinding financial strain that plagued their entire mission. We have examined the constant threat and the logistical burden. We now turn to the bedrock problem that underlay every other misery, the economics of the mission. The ninth, and perhaps most pervasive, reason why the apostolic life was so profoundly difficult was the constant financial strain, the challenge of feeding the world and sustaining a global ministry with absolutely no guaranteed revenue stream or institutional support. The apostles, unlike priests in established religions who had tithes and temples to provide for them, were fundamentally anti-economic actors. They had given up their wealth, and they were commanded not to seek new wealth, forcing them into a state of permanent professional poverty. This existence required them to constantly navigate the humiliating reality of receiving handouts and the impossible logistical challenge of self-sustainability while endlessly traveling. Consider the reality of manual labor while maintaining a preaching schedule. Figures like Paul, the tent maker, are often romanticized for their dedication to their trade, but the reality was brutal. After walking for weeks, preaching all day in a crowded, hostile marketplace, Paul would then have to spend his evenings weaving goat hair cloth to earn enough money for the next day's bread and lodging. This tent making was not a hobby. It was a desperate, exhausting necessity. This need to work just to survive meant they had less time for teaching, less time for healing, and less time for rest. It severely limited their missionary scope, forcing them to remain in one place for extended periods to earn enough capital for the next leg of their journey. Every mile they walked was a deficit on their balance sheet, and every meal they ate was a reduction in their runway. The alternative to labor was the continuous, humiliating reliance on charity, which was not always freely given. While they accepted aid, it was frequently insufficient or came with social strings attached, the implicit debt of gratitude, the pressure to conform, or the need to constantly beg. This financial fragility contradicted the triumphal nature of their message, forcing them to constantly defend why the representatives of the most powerful kingdom in history were surviving on the generosity of strangers. This poverty-driven existence inevitably fed into the internal conflicts over money and resources, a pervasive and destructive stressor within the early church. We see this early on with the dispute over the distribution of food to widows, a crisis that required the creation of the deacons to manage. This wasn't a philosophical disagreement. It was a hungry argument over limited, necessary resources. Money, or the lack thereof, was the sharp, practical wedge that threatened to split the community apart. The constant need to collect funds, manage them discreetly, and allocate them fairly created administrative and moral headaches. How do you move collected funds safely across the bandit-ridden Roman roads? How do you ensure accountability when there are no formal banks or receipts? The financial system of the early mission was a terrifyingly inefficient, high-risk operation, dependent entirely on human trust and integrity. The overall economic reality of being an apostle was a trap. They needed to travel to preach, but travel consumed money. They needed money, but earning it consumed time away from their primary mission. They were locked in a cycle of poverty and strain, a self-imposed financial austerity that served as a continuous, painful test of their faith. The ultimate irony is that they were preaching about treasures that would last forever, while their own earthly possessions consisted of a single tunic and a worn pair of sandals. They were feeding the world with hope while constantly struggling to feed themselves with bread. This constant financial struggle defined their daily life, making the job of being an apostle not just dangerous, but profoundly, relentlessly difficult. We have now fully detailed the political, logistical, and economic crucible that shaped their incredible mission. The physical perils of the mission, the Roman pursuit, the brutal roads, and the hostile mobs were immense. Yet the 10th major stressor was the one that corroded the apostolic community from within: the constant scourge of false brothers, internal treachery, and deceit. The apostles soon discovered that a community of faith was also a constant security threat, and that non-existent trust was the price of pioneering a movement under extreme duress. In a society where every official contact was suspicious, every stranger a potential bandit, and every journey fraught with peril, the one place the apostles should have found absolute safety was among their own. The tragedy was that this sanctuary was often contaminated by self-interest, competition, and outright malice. The initial simplicity of their shared life quickly dissolved into a complex landscape of human failings, magnified by the stakes of their heavenly mandate. The problems began almost immediately, manifesting as disputes over doctrine and competition for influence. When a fledgling faith is built on the testimonies of men who learned by trial and error, variations in understanding are inevitable. But in the anxious, high-stakes environment of the early church, a simple difference in interpretation could be leveraged into a power struggle. An apostle who spent time in Jerusalem might claim doctrinal superiority over a messenger working in a distant Hellenistic city. This wasn't merely academic debate. It was a rivalry for the limited resources, the scarce loyalty of followers, and the right to shape the future of the message. These internal battles sapped energy and time that should have been spent preaching, forcing the apostles to constantly defend their authority against men who looked, spoke, and often acted just like them. Beyond the doctrinal squabbles lay the issue of outright betrayal and infiltration. As the Christian movement grew, attracting followers from diverse backgrounds, Jews, Gentiles, the wealthy, and the enslaved, it also attracted opportunists. These false brothers, as Paul famously termed them, were individuals who joined the community not out of faith, but for personal gain. A free meal, social leverage, or a platform for their own political or religious agendas. They were the fifth column, the source of leaked information, and the people most likely to turn hostile when the tide of persecution inevitably turned against the community. The danger posed by these infiltrators was lethal because it was insidious. An outsider could be easily dismissed. An insider, with access to the apostles' travel plans, their sources of funding, and the identity of their safe houses, was a weapon aimed directly at the heart of the mission. The apostles had to develop an internal vigilance, a deep, unsettling suspicion of every new face and every enthusiastic convert, turning every meeting into a subtle security assessment. This constant need to verify the loyalty of their restored, supposed allies was a draining psychological tax. The security threat was inextricably linked to their financial situation. As explored in the previous segment, the collection and distribution of funds was a perilous, high-risk operation. The money intended for widows and orphans was a powerful temptation for those with weak character. The internal theft and financial manipulation that plagued the early church revealed that the community's greatest vulnerability was often its own humanity. The very act of managing shared resources intended to demonstrate communal unity became a source of distrust and internal division. This pervasive lack of trust reached its terrifying pinnacle in the ultimate loss of fidelity, the betrayal of Judas Iscariot. Though this happened early in the ministry, its psychological reverberations continued to define the apostles' existence. The knowledge that one of the 12, one of the men who had shared their meals, witnessed the miracles, and been entrusted with the deepest spiritual truths, could turn asset into liability for a handful of silver created an enduring trauma. It taught the survivors a devastating lesson. Proximity to the divine offered no guarantee against human wickedness. For the apostles who continued the mission, the memory of Judas was a permanent cautionary shadow. It meant that every new leader they appointed, every deacon they ordained, and every fellow apostle they worked alongside was viewed through the lens of that ultimate failure of character. The mission required them to build networks of trust rapidly and extensively, yet their primary experience had taught them that the most dangerous enemies were often wearing the same mantle as them. This internal conflict, the battle against the enemy within the gates of faith, naturally leads to a closer, more painful examination of the original betrayer himself. The problem of internal treachery, a persistent wound in the early church, had its foundational trauma in the actions of Judas Iscariot. The 11th misery of the apostolic existence was the psychological toll of this intimate, catastrophic betrayal, an event that demonstrated how quickly a trusted colleague could become the ultimate asset to the enemy. This was more than a political handover. It was a deeply personal failure of the chosen circle, forcing the surviving 11 to constantly question their own judgment and loyalty. For the apostles, Judas was not merely a historical footnote or a necessary evil. He was a mirror reflecting their own potential for failure. They had all, at various times, argued, doubted, and misunderstood their teacher's mission. But Judas took that human frailty and weaponized it. The 20 pieces of silver he received were the symbolic price of turning the movement's greatest asset, its unique, secret knowledge of its leader's movements and identity, into a legal liability for the Roman and Jewish authorities. The betrayal was an act of profound strategic intelligence, precisely because Judas knew exactly what the authorities needed. They didn't require a public address or a grand confrontation. They needed a quiet, precise identification in the dark, away from the unpredictable, sympathetic crowds. Judas provided the ultimate insider's service. He was a high-value security breach, a trusted agent who converted familiarity into the most efficient means of capture. The high cost he exacted was not just financial. It was the cost of destroying the surviving apostles' absolute certainty in their fellowship. The psychological impact of this intimate betrayal on the surviving 11 was devastating and long-lasting. If a man chosen directly by their teacher, a man who walked alongside them for 3 years, could choose silver over salvation, what did that say about the reliability of their own convictions? Doubt, fear, and self-recrimination must have been rampant. Every time Peter denied his association, every time Thomas questioned the resurrection, they were wrestling not just with their own fear, but with the terrifying precedent set by Judas. That failure was possible, even for the most dedicated. This trauma forced a deep, painful introspection upon the remaining core group. They had to rebuild the foundation of their ministry on the knowledge that their inner circle was fallible and capable of the deepest wickedness. The election of a replacement for Judas, Matthias, was not just an administrative formality. It was a necessary psychological repair, an attempt to prove that the breach was sealed and the core unit could once again be trusted. Yet, the memory lingered, serving as a permanent lesson on the fragile nature of human commitment under pressure. Furthermore, the betrayal carried profound political fallout. The authorities could, and likely did, use the incident as propaganda. They could argue that the movement was inherently corrupt, driven by self-interest, and that even the inner circle contained dissenters who recognized the message as a fraud. This narrative undermined the apostles' public credibility, forcing them to constantly defend their moral integrity in the face of the most damning evidence that their own treasurer had sold them out. In the ensuing mission, this experience forced the apostles to become masters of vetting and accountability. They could never again afford to delegate responsibility, especially financial control, without intense scrutiny. The constant awareness that wealth, even small amounts of it, could be a temptation to treachery meant they were always operating on a psychological razor's edge. The ghost of Judas stood over every shared meal, every collection of alms, and every decision about who could be trusted with the community's secrets. The story of Judas Iscariot is the perfect encapsulation of the human difficulty within the divine mission. It proved that the greatest threat was often not the imperial sword, but the familiar face that turns traitor. This deep, personal wound of betrayal set the stage for the rest of their ministry, forcing them to lead a global movement, while perpetually fighting the deep-seated impulse of doubt. The surviving apostles had to preach a message of ultimate trust to the world, all while grappling with the most profound lesson in distrust delivered by their former colleague. It is this internal struggle that made the next external pressure, the performance of their greatest powers, a stressor rather than a relief. The apostles had survived the internal catastrophe of betrayal, yet their struggles continued on the public stage, often intensified by the very thing that validated their mission: divine power. The 12th reason the apostolic life was a relentless stress was the humiliating burden of their miraculous power, a double-edged sword that brought far more danger and pressure than it offered peace. Miracles, for the apostles, were not celebratory demonstrations of spiritual dominance. They were often chaotic, exhausting, and politically volatile events. While they provided undeniable proof of the message, they instantly attracted the wrong kind of attention: unwanted crowds, immediate political scrutiny, and accusations of sorcery. This attention did not make their mission easier. It amplified the danger and made low-profile, long-term evangelism virtually impossible. Consider the aftermath of a public healing. It was not a tidy event where the healed person simply walked away quietly. It instantly created a riotous, uncontrollable crowd, hungry not for the message, but for the performance. The apostles would suddenly find themselves overwhelmed by the sick, the desperate, and the opportunistic, all demanding their turn. They were instantly transformed from humble preachers into public healers, a role that brought with it the impossible pressure to solve every problem for every person who demanded it. This pressure was an immense psychological weight. Every healing they performed set a new, impossible standard. If they could heal one blind man, why not all the blind men in the city? If they could raise one person from the dead, why not their loved one who passed last week? The power did not bring peace or quiet authority. It brought expectation that was impossible to satisfy, leaving a trail of disappointed, sometimes angry, people in their wake who felt betrayed by the limits of the apostles' divine reach. Furthermore, the public performance of miracles instantly attracted the attention of local authorities, both Roman and Jewish. The Romans were deeply suspicious of anyone who wielded unusual power. In the context of the empire, the ability to manipulate nature or heal terminal illness was not seen as a divine gift, but as dangerous sorcery, or worse, a political stunt designed to gather followers for an illegal purpose. Performing a miracle was often the quickest way to get arrested for practicing forbidden magic or sedition. The apostles constantly had to defend their power not as a trick, but as a genuine religious event, a defense that often fell on deaf, cynical ears. The religious establishment viewed the miracles with intense hostility, seeing them as direct threats to their own spiritual authority. The question was not if the power was real, but where it came from. When the authorities could not deny the healing, they simply shifted the accusation, claiming the apostles were acting by the power of the devil or performing black magic. This accusation of sorcery was devastatingly effective in turning public opinion against them, instantly transforming a grateful crowd into a volatile, fearful mob. The miracles also created logistical nightmares. An apostle could not simply sneak out of town after a successful healing. The news would travel faster than their feet. The attention locked them into a community, forcing them to remain until the situation became politically or socially too hot, often necessitating hurried, dangerous escapes. Their own success became their greatest operational risk. Their power was a terrifying gift. It was a required tool for conversion, yet it was the direct cause of most of their persecution, imprisonment, and eventual execution. They were simultaneously commanded to use their power to validate the message and punished relentlessly for daring to do so in the public eye. The stress of this double bind, the need to heal, but the fear of the consequences, defined their every movement. This constant exposure to public volatility, driven by both good works and dangerous accusations, brings us directly to the next inevitable conflict, the unpredictable mob. The 12th segment highlighted how miracles were a magnet for dangerous public attention. The 13th misery of the apostolic existence was dealing with the unpredictable, irrational, and physically destructive force of the mob. The apostles were constantly struggling against a pervasive torrent of misinformation and volatile crowds, which often erupted into sudden, violent outbursts over the simplest misunderstandings. They were often victims of instant, irrational public anger, necessitating immediate, unplanned, and desperate escapes. The apostolic struggle was less about fighting men with swords and more about fighting the invisible, relentless enemy of gossip. In the ancient world, news traveled not by decree or official report, but by word of mouth, rumor, and often deliberate malicious falsehoods. A rumor that an apostle had blasphemed in the synagogue, or that they had healed someone by Roman sorcery, could travel through a marketplace in minutes, instantly transforming a neutral crowd into a lynch mob. The apostles' life was a constant, exhausting battle against misinformation. They were forced to operate in an environment where their reputation was entirely dependent on the last person who spoke about them. They had no ability to issue press releases, counter narratives, or defend themselves in a controlled forum. Their only defense was their moral conduct and the strength of their testimony, which were often powerless against a tide of popular rage fueled by fear or professional jealousy from local craftsmen or religious leaders. We see this dynamic repeatedly in the book of Acts. In Ephesus, where the silversmiths rioted because the apostles' message was threatening their business of making idols. In Lystra, where the same crowd that worshipped Paul and Barnabas as gods suddenly turned on them and stoned Paul after a brief, misleading rumor circulated. These crowds were not rational legal bodies. They were volatile, irrational, and capable of instant, devastating violence based on emotional rather than evidential conviction. This meant the apostles were permanently on high alert. Every crowd was a potential threat, and every gathering required a simultaneous reading of the spiritual atmosphere and the social tension. They had to be ready to drop everything, mid-sermon, mid-meal, mid-healing, and execute an immediate, unplanned escape under cover of darkness or through back alleys. These escapes were not dramatic, choreographed feats of action. They were humiliating, desperate flights from immediate physical harm, often leaving behind their few possessions and the fragile communities they had just founded. The The social and psychological cost of this volatility was immense. It meant they could never settle, never truly trust the stability of their surroundings, and never know which simple word or gesture would ignite the next conflagration. The trauma of facing a mob, the sound of the roaring voices, the feel of the stones hitting their backs, the taste of the dirt as they ran, was a recurring, inevitable event. This constant threat of random, civilian violence was arguably harder to endure than the organized violence of the Romans. Roman torture and execution, though lethal, were at least predictable, following an institutional pattern. Mob violence was purely chaotic, erupting without warning, driven by fickle sentiment, and impossible to negotiate with or reason against. The sheer unpredictability created a crippling, pervasive anxiety. This pattern of mob violence, fueled by gossip and misinformation, inevitably led to the ultimate, final form of conflict: Roman torture and execution. While the mob might break bones and steal clothes, it was the institutional, systematic violence that ended the mission for nearly all the original apostles. The fact that their careers were punctuated by constant beatings and immediate desperate flight set the stage for their final, inevitable sacrifice under the cold, rationalized cruelty of the Roman Empire. The unpredictable violence of the mob, as detailed in the previous segment, was terrifying, but it was merely a prelude to the controlled, institutionalized cruelty of the Roman state. The 14th crushing reality of the apostolic mission was the constant, existential threat posed by the Roman judicial machine, a bureaucratic system that viewed their lives as utterly expendable. Failure to convince a court meant not just imprisonment, but a guaranteed path to torture or death, confirming that they had indeed failed to escape the purview of the emperor's census. For the Roman Empire, the apostles were not ideological enemies, but rather minor legal inconveniences, a failure of local governance to maintain quiet order. Their arrests were not solemn political trials, but often casual administrative decisions made by weary provincial governors, more concerned with filling their quota of public order than with parsing theological distinctions. The process was summary, brutal, and almost always concluded with the assumption of guilt. The horrors of Roman justice and punishment were immediate and degrading. The first and most common cruelty was the lash. Flogging was not merely a punishment, it was a ritualized destruction of dignity and health, designed to inflict maximum pain and public humiliation. The implements used, often the flagellum with bone or metal tips woven into the leather thongs, were engineered to tear flesh and expose bone. For men already physically weakened by years of hunger, exposure, and constant flight, a Roman scourging was not a deterrent. It was a fast track to permanent disability or death from systemic shock and infection. Paul, in his writings, recounts being subjected to this torture repeatedly, a casual testament to the commonplace nature of this violence. The prison was the next, more prolonged horror. Unlike modern facilities, Roman jails were not places designed for rehabilitation or even long-term detention, but simply holding cells before trial, execution, or sale into slavery. To be imprisoned by Rome was often a sentence of slow decay. The apostle was suddenly removed from the open air, the sun, and the chance of a hurried escape, and plunged into a dark, suffocating environment that was a faster killer than any bandit. The casual cruelty of provincial governors was a constant feature of this experience. They held absolute power over life and death, and often treated the apostles as insignificant local problems whose disposal would smooth over a political issue or appease a local pressure group. The apostles' life might be traded for a moment of political calm or a better relationship with the local Jewish council. There was no appeal to justice, only to the political expediency of the moment. This lack of legal recourse meant that even if an apostle, such as Paul, possessed Roman citizenship, the local governor still held immense arbitrary power to inflict hardship. The trials themselves were often farcical, theatrical displays of Roman authority over native resistance. The accusations were vague, disturbing the peace, introducing new gods, treason, and the defense was often unheard or dismissed with contempt. The judicial process was a machinery of degradation, designed to confirm Rome's absolute dominance and make an example of those who dared to defy its order. The apostle was not permitted to argue theology. They were permitted only to confirm that they were indeed low-status itinerants preaching a politically dangerous message. Failure to convince this indifferent court of their harmlessness meant not only the continuation of imprisonment, but the anticipation of execution. For non-citizens, this was often crucifixion, the most agonizing and publicly shaming death the empire had devised. For Roman citizens like Paul, it was usually beheading, a quicker but equally final end. The constant awareness that this casual, bureaucratic disposal of their lives was perpetually imminent added a layer of psychological torment to every waking moment of their mission. This profound fear of Roman justice and the immediate, terrifying reality of their prisons demanded a deeper look at the environment where they often spent their last days. The Roman courtroom was the final staging ground for their humiliation, but the prison was where the apostles' dedication was truly tested against the most wretched physical reality. The 15th layer of misery was the sheer, lethal grimness of first-century prisons, places where claustrophobia, chains, and contagious disease collaborated to enact a death sentence without the need for a formal executioner. Imprisonment was not isolation. It was a fast, unsanitary, and freezing descent into biological and physical collapse. The reality of Roman jails, especially the holding cells in provincial cities, bears no resemblance to modern correctional facilities. These were often repurposed dungeons, cisterns, or basements, dark, airless, and perpetually damp. The apostle was cast into a space that embodied filth. There was no sanitation, forcing prisoners to live in their own waste. Water was scarce and often contaminated. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, untreated wounds, and sickness. Claustrophobia was compounded by the physical reality of the restraints. Apostles were often shackled with heavy iron chains, typically secured around their ankles or wrists, or even linked to a guard. These restraints were not only a symbol of their captivity, but a massive physical detriment. They chafed the skin, leading to open sores that rapidly became infected in the unsanitary environment. They made movement difficult and sleep agonizingly uncomfortable. The constant weight of the iron was a perpetual reminder of their powerlessness and a continuous source of debilitating pain. The freezing cold was an equally serious threat. Stone structures, especially subterranean ones, retain a chilling, bone-deep cold, especially in the damp climates of coastal cities. Without adequate clothing, often only the rags they were arrested in, and with no heat source, the apostles were perpetually battling hypothermia. This relentless cold sapped their remaining strength, lowered their immune systems, and made them vulnerable to the contagious diseases that ran rampant through the confined spaces. Imprisonment, therefore, was a fast track to disease or starvation. The most common killers were dysentery, typhus, and various fevers, spreading rapidly through the communal filth. The constant hunger they suffered on the road only intensified the vulnerability in prison. Food, if provided at all, was usually meager, rotten, or depended entirely on the unreliable charity of outside supporters who often risked their own safety just to deliver a loaf of bread or a jug of water to the prison gate. Survival in prison was a daily, agonizing test of their physical limits, emphasizing the extreme cost of their dedication. For the apostles, especially Paul, the ability to survive and even maintain his spiritual ministry from these conditions was a testament to impossible endurance. He wrote his most profound theological works while chained, cold, and hungry. The very act of composing a letter in this environment, finding a scrap of parchment, dipping a reed pen in ink, and articulating complex theology with chattering teeth and aching limbs required an unparalleled mental and physical fortitude. The sheer misery of the prison experience transitioned their focus from the survival of their bodies to the survival of the message itself. If they were going to die here, as many prisoners did, they needed to ensure their teaching outlasted their physical decay. This desperation to communicate their final thoughts, to address the doctrinal crises in the churches they had founded, gave rise to the most precious documents they would ever write. It is this intense, desperate necessity to communicate under lethal duress that leads us to the physical agony of writing the New Testament epistles in chains. Emerging from the darkness of the Roman jail cell, the 16th difficulty confronting the apostle was the agonizing logistical challenge of documenting their faith. The epistles, the very foundation of much of the New Testament, were not penned in tranquil studies with endless supplies of parchment. They were composed in conditions of constant physical discomfort, poor lighting, and under the watchful eye of a Roman guard. The sheer physical difficulty of composing complex theology while in chains was immense. Imagine attempting to articulate the nuances of grace or the complexity of the resurrection while shackled to a wall or a soldier in a dark, damp corner of a prison. Paul, the most prolific writer, faced this reality frequently. His body was often racked with pain from past beatings, his hands sore from the constant friction of iron, and his mind fighting the persistent cloud of hunger and exhaustion. This was the physical crucible in which the most enduring Christian writings were forged. The logistical problems were manifold. First, there was the problem of the scribe. The apostles, being low status, often illiterate laborers, with the exception of Paul, who was formally educated, required an intermediary to take dictation. Finding a literate, trustworthy person who was also willing to risk associating with a political prisoner was a high-risk endeavor. These scribes, or amanuenses, were not merely secretaries. They were co-conspirators, risking arrest and torture for the simple act of recording a dangerous message. Their availability was intermittent, their time expensive, and their presence unpredictable. Then came the materials. Writing an epistle required obtaining parchment or papyrus, both relatively costly materials. Ink, made from soot and gum, and the reed pen were also commodities that had to be smuggled in, often at great risk to the courier. The very act of acquiring these basic supplies was a miniature, high-stakes operation in itself. Poor lighting was another pervasive enemy. In a windowless prison cell, the dim light filtering in from a distant corridor, or the weak glow of a sputtering oil lamp, strained the eyes of both the apostle dictating and the scribe struggling to record the words neatly. The speed of composition was limited by the speed at which the scribe could see and write, and the hours were limited by the availability of light. The result was often rushed, cramped script, composed in agonizing bursts whenever circumstances allowed. Furthermore, the apostle had to battle constant distractions. They were sharing their limited space with other prisoners, dealing with the noise of the guards, and perpetually aware of their own imminent danger. Composing highly complex, systematic theology, such as the Epistle to the Romans, required deep focus and uninterrupted contemplation, a luxury utterly unavailable to a prisoner in a Roman dungeon. The letters are therefore a testament not only to spiritual inspiration, but to immense mental discipline under duress. The final logistical nightmare was the immediate security problem of the document itself. Once written, the letter was the most dangerous piece of evidence imaginable, a confession of belief, a record of internal communication, and a clear directive for an illegal movement. It could not simply be mailed. This necessary communication, vital for the survival and doctrinal consistency of the fledgling church, now had to be entrusted to a courier and risked all the perils of the Roman road, leading us directly to the dangers of the high-risk mail route. The struggle to write the epistles in a cold, dark cell was only half the battle. The 17th and final misery of the mission was the high-risk reality of getting those letters to their destination. The documents that would eventually form the core of the New Testament were not delivered by a professional, state-protected postal service. They were hand-carried on dangerous routes by couriers who risked persecution, imprisonment, and death with every mile they traveled. The path of the apostles' letters was a gauntlet of risk. The couriers, often trusted, high-ranking members of the early church like Tychicus or Phoebe, were tasked with carrying the physical evidence of an illegal foreign cult across vast territories ruled by the Roman law. If intercepted by Roman authorities, the letter was a death sentence, not just for the courier, but for the apostle who dictated it, as it confirmed the seditious communication between conspirators. The letter itself was an operational document, and its discovery would lead to the immediate arrest and destruction of the community it was addressed to. The couriers themselves were subject to all the physical dangers of the road: bandits, shipwrecks, disease, and the pervasive suspicion of local authorities. They had to travel with extreme caution, often concealing the letters within their clothing or baggage, constantly battling the paranoia that they were being followed or observed. For the apostle waiting in prison, the fate of the letter and the life of the courier were a constant, agonizing preoccupation. The failure of a courier to arrive might mean they were captured, killed, or that the crucial message was lost forever. Beyond the physical danger, the messages risked being misinterpreted, forged, or destroyed. Because communication was slow and infrequent, a misunderstanding in a letter could fester for months, leading to doctrinal confusion or factional splits in the distant communities. This led to the need for the couriers to act as interpreters and temporary ambassadors, verbally explaining the apostles' intent and defending the authenticity of the message against detractors. They were, in essence, the walking embodiment of the letter, making their personal safety doubly important. The problem of forgery was particularly acute. In the absence of institutional authentication, rivals or false teachers could easily circulate forged letters, claiming apostolic authority for their own divisive doctrines. The apostles were often forced to include specific, personal greetings or signature lines at the end of their letters, such as Paul's note that he was writing the final lines with his own hand, as an early form of security verification. This high-risk mail route underscored the extreme fragility of their early communication network. This difficulty of control set up the very doctrinal division that plagued the early church. The lack of reliable, instantaneous communication meant that communities grew up in relative isolation, developing local customs and interpretations that often clashed with the core teachings of the founding apostles. The letters, which were meant to unify and instruct, were always playing catch-up, attempting to correct errors and reaffirm the true message after the confusion had already taken root. Thus, the entire mission, from the moment the apostles left their fishing boats to the final, perilous delivery of their written testament, was characterized by a unique and brutal form of suffering. Their work was built on constant poverty, political persecution, physical degradation, and the relentless fight against both external armies and internal betrayal. They lived and died as fugitives, their lives dictated by the need to evade the census, survive the prison, and get the word out at any cost. The fragility of their written communication, as detailed in the previous segment, was compounded exponentially by the challenges of oral communication. The 18th major difficulty, and arguably the most continuous source of stress for the apostles, was the linguistic nightmare of their mission. The constant difficulty of translating profound theological ideas across a chaotic diversity of languages and cultural contexts. This was the Tower of Babel problem reborn, where every word choice was a potential heresy, a cultural offense, or a fatal misunderstanding. The apostles began as speakers of Aramaic, a Semitic language of the Galilean countryside, to address the local populace in Judea and the smaller synagogues. This sufficed. But their mandate was global. To speak to the Roman world, they needed Koine Greek, the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, and to interact with the imperial government and elite, some knowledge of Latin was useful, though less common. Immediately, they were thrust into a world requiring continuous, high-stakes translation, often without the aid of professional interpreters. Translating simple concepts was hard enough, but conveying complex, culturally specific theological ideas proved agonizing. How does one accurately render the Aramaic concept of Malkuth Shemayim, Kingdom of Heaven, into the Greek Basileia tou Theo, without losing the unique Jewish, political, and spiritual resonance. How does one explain the nuanced sacrificial concept of redemption to a Gentile audience whose understanding of divine transaction was rooted in Roman state rituals or mystery cults? Every word was a minefield. A seemingly innocuous choice could inadvertently align the message with a competing philosophy, or, worse, with a known political sedition. The apostles constantly faced the risk of heresy by translation. If they translated the teacher's title too closely to a known messianic movement, they risked immediate Roman execution. If they made it too abstract, they risked being dismissed as simply another street philosopher. This required them to possess not just fluency in multiple languages, but an almost impossible cultural fluency, understanding the nuances and dangers inherent in every linguistic bridge they built. The stress was magnified by the reliance on local, untrained interpreters and the necessity of speaking to crowds in a language not their own. When Paul, a highly educated Hellenized Jew, spoke Greek, he did so with the constant awareness that his every phrase was being judged by native speakers who might dismiss him not for his theology, but for his grammar or accent. For the less educated apostles like Peter, speaking to a Greek audience meant relying on rough, colloquial koine, which inevitably reinforced their low-status perception, already a massive barrier to credibility. The need to communicate across this linguistic chasm required constant, high-stakes clarification. The doctrinal disputes that emerged in various churches often stemmed not from willful rebellion, but from pure communication breakdown. Did the apostle mean faith as an abstract, philosophical belief, or faith as demonstrable, active loyalty? Did the term for law refer to Jewish ceremonial law, Roman civil law, or a deeper moral principle? The letters they wrote were frequently efforts to correct these distant, language-based misunderstandings. Furthermore, the apostles were often forced to rely on the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, which itself contained linguistic and theological shifts. When preaching to Gentiles, they were constantly interpreting one language, Aramaic, into another, Greek, while referencing texts that had already undergone a previous layer of linguistic change, Hebrew to Greek. This multi-layered linguistic instability created a pervasive intellectual anxiety. The stress of knowing that a single, incorrectly chosen word could jeopardize the entire divine truth they were mandated to deliver. This communication struggle, rooted in the Tower of Babel problem, was the ultimate amplifier of doctrinal disagreement. If they could not be certain that the words they spoke in Ephesus were understood in the same way they were spoken in Antioch, then how could they ensure theological unity across a global faith separated by vast distances? This constant, existential challenge to their message's integrity naturally led to the inevitable and painful battles over doctrine and authority itself. Having wrestled with the linguistic turmoil, the 19th continuous drain on the apostolic mission was the relentless, painful battle for doctrinal purity and the assertion of authority. The early church was not a monolithic body, but a collection of disparate, anxious communities constantly fighting an internal Cold War over who had the right to speak, what laws applied to the new converts, and how to police the message against distortion. The stress of unifying a global faith while separated by vast distances often felt like a spiritual siege. The central conflict was immediately defined by the question, who gets to be an apostle? This struggle primarily pitted the original Jerusalem core, those who walked with the teacher against Paul, the latecomer whose authority was based solely on a dramatic post-resurrection encounter. Paul's ministry was revolutionary, but his claims of authority were constantly challenged by those who demanded physical proximity to the teacher as the only legitimate credential. This was not a minor personality clash. It was a fundamental argument about the nature of divine authority itself, forcing Paul to constantly defend his apostleship, diverting immense energy and focus from the external mission. His letters, particularly Galatians, were less theological treatises and more political necessities, lengthy, passionate defenses detailing personal encounters and divine visions to prove he was not a subordinate of Jerusalem but a primary voice. This constant need for self-justification, a tiresome and often humiliating political necessity, drained the very reserves he needed for preaching the gospel. This conflict over personnel was inextricably linked to the issue of what laws applied to the new converts, specifically the tension between Jew and Gentile. The Jerusalem faction often insisted that Gentiles must first become Jews, undergo circumcision, and adhere to strict dietary laws before fully embracing the message. Paul, conversely, fiercely argued for salvation through grace alone, without the burden of the Mosaic law. This division threatened to split the entire movement into two incompatible sects. The Council of Jerusalem, recorded in the book of Acts, was not a peaceful retreat, but a high-stakes, stressful negotiation to prevent the faith from collapsing under its own legal weight. A tense room where the future of the faith hinged on a handful of men reaching a painful compromise. The debate was not abstract. It was visible at every shared dinner table. When Peter, the rock and the respected elder apostle, refused to eat with uncircumcised Gentiles under pressure from the conservative contingent, the entire message of communal unity was instantly destroyed. This pressure led to public confrontations, such as the famous episode in Antioch, where Paul had to publicly rebuke Peter for his hypocrisy, demonstrating that the internal conflict was so volatile it could tear the leadership apart in front of the fledgling community. The pressure to police the message against distortion was immense. The apostles were not just facing external persecution, they were fighting a continuous battle against dangerous syncretism and early Gnostic influences that sought to dilute the message by blending it with existing Greek philosophy or mystery religions. False teachers were constantly infiltrating communities, offering easier paths, more secretive knowledge, or doctrines that satisfied cultural expectations, particularly the dualistic Gnostic idea that the spirit was good and the material world was inherently evil. This doctrine was a spiritual virus, fundamentally undermining the core Christian belief in the goodness of creation, the necessity of the incarnation, and the physical resurrection of the body. The apostles had to fight this pervasive intellectual threat that claimed to possess a superior, secret gnosis or knowledge that only the elite could access. These internal threats were often more dangerous than Roman legions because they were invisible, charismatic, and corrupted the very soul of the communities the apostles had suffered so much to build, leading members astray from within. The need for doctrinal consistency was amplified by the vast distances separating the leaders. While a heresy might erupt in Corinth, the apostles in Jerusalem or Rome could take months to hear about it, and more months to send a definitive, correcting response via the perilous mail route. This spatial separation meant that distortion could take root and spread rapidly, leaving the apostles in a perpetual state of chasing doctrinal fires across the Mediterranean world, always playing catch-up. The sheer length of the delay, a 6-month gap between a community posing a question and receiving a vetted answer, meant that the apostle often arrived to find the damage already done, the community split, and the false doctrine established as if it were gospel. This logistical instability forced the apostles into emotionally draining cleanup operations and the painful separation of members who refused correction. The burden of unifying this scattered, persecuted, and often confused global faith fell squarely on the shoulders of a handful of men with no modern communication tools, no institutional funding, and a deep history of personal betrayal. The stress was existential. If they failed to maintain doctrinal unity, the message would fragment into 1,000 harmless, forgettable cults. Their letters became their primary weapon in this battle, transforming them from simple testimonials into complex judicial documents designed to settle theological disputes, rebuke false teachers, and reassert central authority. This dedication to a mission that prioritized the faith's survival above all else carried a profoundly personal and often silent cost: the abandonment of their own families. The extreme demands of maintaining this global, fractured doctrine meant that the apostles had no choice but to permanently sever their primary connection to hearth and home, a sacrifice that was necessary for the mission's success but created a deep human void. This profound, unspoken toll on their personal lives is the focus of our next segment. The rigors of the mission, from linguistic battles to doctrinal wars, necessitated a total commitment that came at an immense unpaid cost: the abandonment of their own families. The 20th misery of the apostolic contract was not just the personal sacrifice they made, but the familial abandonment of wives, children, and their entire personal legacy, left behind to face poverty and persecution without their primary protector and provider. This hidden, profound cost is often overlooked in the grand narrative of their ministry. The original call to follow me for men like Peter and Andrew was an absolute one-way commitment. It was a choice that prioritized the kingdom above the hearth. For the apostles who were married, their departure left their wives and children in a precarious, vulnerable position in a deeply patriarchal and economically brutal society. In the first century, a man's identity was tied to his trade and his essential role as a provider. When a fisherman abandoned his boat, he wasn't just sacrificing his income. He was liquidating his family's future, his entire capital investment, and his children's inheritance. That single decision instantly turned his dependents from having a subsistence living to being indigent wanderers themselves. In Roman law and social custom, a woman who was effectively deserted by her husband, especially one who was now a wanted political subversive, had almost no legal standing. She could not easily reclaim his property, manage his business assets, which were often seized or abandoned, or defend her children's interests in court. She was immediately thrust into a desperate fight for survival, facing the societal scorn and economic ruin of being associated with a perpetual fugitive. The families faced persecution not for their own preaching, but for the mere fact of their relationship to a notorious and wanted man. They were, in essence, collateral damage in the Roman pursuit of the apostles. The children, too, paid a heavy price. They were deprived of a father figure during their crucial formative years, subjected to the poverty that followed the loss of the family business, and likely grew up with the social stigma of being the children of a notorious lower-class preacher. Their education, their ability to secure a good marriage, which often depended on a dowry or a trade, and their inheritance, all vanished the moment their father chose the road. The calling, therefore, was not merely a personal act of faith. It was a unilateral decision that guaranteed hardship and lifelong struggle for those they loved most. This profound sacrifice was not a temporary deployment. It was permanent. The apostles were on the move for decades, often imprisoned, rarely able to return home for more than the briefest, most dangerous visits. Their wives became, in effect, permanent widows, forced to rely on the nascent and often strained charity of the small, local Christian communities for their very existence. This situation created a deep psychological burden for the apostles. The constant nagging knowledge that their own devotion was actively causing suffering and danger for their loved ones. They were teaching communities to trust God for tomorrow, yet they had no idea if their own children were safe, fed, or even alive. This internal contradiction was a huge source of mental pain, a guilt that was impossible to reconcile with the joy of the mission. The familial crisis was directly linked to the total lack of personal property that characterized their lives. The choice to abandon family was intrinsically linked to the decision to own nothing. Owning property would have rooted them to one spot, made them easy targets for tax collectors, and provided a legal liability that could be seized by Roman authorities. By owning nothing, they remained elusive, but also permanently dependent. The renunciation of material goods guaranteed their freedom of movement, but also ensured their utter destitution and the destitution of those they left behind. When family members, terrified by the persecution, or simply bewildered by the radical nature of the commitment, tried to intervene or pull the apostles back, it created agonizing emotional divisions. The choice between the divine mandate and the desperate human plea of a spouse. The apostles had to choose the pain of separation and the guilt of abandonment over the comfort of conventional life, a choice that left an invisible, enduring scar. The combination of familial abandonment and absolute poverty led to a life characterized by communal living and a complete lack of personal space, the final element of their mental drain. The final, relentless drain on the apostolic mind was the total lack of personal sanctuary. Having surrendered their family and their property, the 21st misery was the constant, suffocating reality of communal living, shared possessions, and the absolute inability to ever truly check out or be alone. The apostles were public figures 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no mechanism to escape the crushing pressure of their divine mandate. Communal living, while an ideal expression of early faith and a necessary survival mechanism for the impoverished, was a profound psychological burden. They lived, traveled, ate, and slept in close proximity to a shifting, often volatile group of companions, converts, and strangers. In the cramped urban dwellings and insulae of the first century, privacy was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. The apostles and their followers were often packed into a single room or the open space of a small courtyard. The walls were thin, if they existed at all, and personal intimacy was impossible. There was no such thing as a private moment to process trauma, mourn a loss, or simply rest their minds away from the constant demands of the mission. This lack of private space meant an absolute absence of privacy. Every word was potentially overheard, every moment of weakness observed, and every personal disagreement immediately became a public affair. They were constantly under surveillance, not just by Roman spies and hostile neighbors, but by their own followers who viewed them as living examples, the visible embodiment of the new faith. This constant scrutiny forced them into a performance of perfection that was humanly unsustainable. They had to act as impeccable moral compasses while dealing with chronic hunger, physical pain, overwhelming fear of imminent arrest, and the deep emotional ache of familial separation. The demand for shared possessions and resources, while economically sound for the group, reinforced this lack of personal autonomy. Everything they had, their cloak, their cup, their small amount of money, was communal. They could not simply purchase something for their own comfort or keep a single possession as a private relic. This total renunciation of the material world eliminated a key psychological coping mechanism, the ability to retreat to one's own space or find comfort in a familiar, owned object. The weight of this communal life was compounded by the constant requirement to mediate disputes among followers. Every argument over food distribution, every personal slight between converts, every moment of theological confusion or fear, it all landed on the apostles' lap. They were forced to maintain perpetual composure and offer instant, Solomon-like wisdom, even when they themselves were utterly exhausted or spiritually depleted. Furthermore, they had no safe exit from the pressure. Their job was their life, and their identity was their mission. If an apostle was exhausted, discouraged, or simply needed a break, there was nowhere to go. They could not take a vacation, check into an inn under an assumed name, or retire to the countryside. Their face, their Galilean accent, and their reputation as a wanted preacher followed them everywhere. To stop preaching was to deny the mission. To remain preaching was to guarantee continuous misery and eventual death. They were the living scripture for their converts, the only testament the new believers possessed. They could not afford a moment of visible failure, a flash of anger, a display of despair, a moment of greed, because it instantly corrupted the message for those watching and struggling to maintain their own faith. The relentless nature of the mission, combined with the lack of private space, led to a total mental drain. They were constantly forced to be on, to be teaching, healing, arguing doctrine, and organizing resources. The emotional and mental exhaustion was pervasive, manifesting in the sharp rebukes and periods of profound discouragement recorded in their letters. They were men, operating under the highest stakes, with the lowest possible resources for personal and psychological recovery. Their commitment was total, transforming them from simple laborers into historical fugitives. Their lives, from their initial recruitment to the final, perilous delivery of their letters, were a chronicle of physical pain, political persecution, financial ruin, and profound mental exhaustion. They achieved the impossible not through comfort and ease, but through enduring the precise opposite of every human need. They were perpetually hungry, constantly watched, endlessly in motion, and ultimately violently disposed of. This was the true, brutal contract of the apostles. Having endured the relentless physical and logistical nightmares of the mission, the 22nd and perhaps most agonizing layer of stress was the internal war fought daily against the shadow of self-doubt. The psychological toll of chronic failure, combined with the impossible pressure to live a sinless life under intense public and divine scrutiny, created an unbearable mental strain. Their mission was one of absolute certainty, yet their daily lives were filled with moments of profound, humiliating uncertainty and pervasive anxiety. Every apostle carried the heavy burden of past failures, the most famous being Peter's moments of denial and fear. This guilt was not an academic point. It was a constant, raw wound that never fully healed. The knowledge that in the moment of highest crisis, when their teacher needed them most, they had scattered, hidden, or outright lied about their association, became a permanent, corrosive scar on their psyche. Even years later, after miraculous healings, powerful sermons, and founding multiple churches, that memory of personal cowardice would linger, manifesting as a deep-seated fear that they were fundamentally unworthy of the calling. Paul, though not present at the denial, carried his own, perhaps heavier burden, the knowledge that he had personally overseen the persecution and murder of the very people he was now compelled to serve. This past violence was a dark mirror reflecting his own capacity for failure and a constant reminder that his zeal could easily be misplaced or destructive. This kind of moral history made the apostles intensely vulnerable to attacks from both within and without the church. Their enemies always had ready-made material to question their authority and their sincerity. For apostles who were meant to be the living testament to a divine truth, the pressure to live a sinless life was an impossible demand that crushed their humanity. They were the visible embodiment of the faith, and any stumble, a flash of anger at a colleague, a moment of undue pride in a sermon, a failure in diplomacy that caused a church split, or even a simple expression of fatigue or despair, was instantly magnified and seized upon by their critics, both inside and outside the church, as proof that the entire movement was a fraud. They had no margin for error, and absolutely no private moments for human frailty. Every action, every utterance, and every relationship was scrutinized and judged against a standard of divine perfection. This level of scrutiny, the knowledge that their entire enterprise could be jeopardized by a momentary lapse in judgment, was exhausting. It created a perpetual state of hypervigilance, preventing the mind from ever truly relaxing or recovering from the trauma of the road. The constant worry about leading others astray was another profound source of mental anguish, a crushing responsibility that kept them awake during their brief, cold periods of rest. The early church was filled with new converts, often weak in faith, surrounded by hostile influences, tempted by easy money, and vulnerable to complex, seductive, false doctrines like Gnosticism. The apostles knew their own behavior was the template for survival. If they showed fear in the face of persecution. The entire community might abandon the faith when their own trials began. If they compromised on a core teaching for political expediency or to make the message more palatable to the Roman elite, they risked the eternal souls of their followers. The responsibility for the spiritual integrity and endurance of thousands of scattered believers rested entirely on their ability to maintain perfection and doctrinal purity, a burden no human being could possibly bear without buckling under the spiritual weight. They became responsible not just for their own salvation, but for the salvation of an entire generation of believers whom they rarely even saw. This internal stress often manifested in sharp, public arguments with one another, such as the infamous confrontation between Paul and Peter, where profound theological issues were mixed with personal pride, cultural bias, and tactical error. These were not casual disagreements over dinner. They were explosions of pressure, moments where the weight of the mission became too heavy, causing them to turn their anger and doubt upon their closest colleagues. These conflicts required immediate and painful public resolution, further eroding their already thin personal reserves. The need to quickly reconcile and reestablish a united front, to project an image of seamless authority, only added to the mental fatigue and the necessity of constantly performing unity. The apostles' entire existence was a dichotomy. They were preaching a message of perfect peace, divine power, and ultimate victory. Yet they lived in perpetual fear, grinding poverty, and agonizing doubt about their own worthiness and competence. They were commanded to trust completely, yet every human experience, from Judas's betrayal to the mob's irrational rage, taught them that trust was a liability and that human nature was fundamentally flawed. This psychological paradox created a constant, debilitating anxiety that consumed their minds. They operated in the terrifying overlap between the infinite demands of God and the absolute limits of human endurance. They spent their lives fleeing, not just from the Roman centurions, but from the fear of their own frailty and the knowledge that one moment of internal weakness could undo years of external suffering. This internal stress could only ever be resolved by one final, permanent release. The ultimate external end of their contract, martyrdom. The public misery was the unavoidable conclusion of their contract. The executioner's payment. The final chapter of nearly every apostle's life was not a peaceful passing in old age surrounded by loved ones, but a violent public death. A gruesome reality that was the inevitable consequence of their mission. This martyrdom was not a glorious, sanitized end, but a brutal, messy, and painful spectacle designed entirely as a public deterrent to erase their memory and intimidate their followers into silence. It was the highest price for the lowest status. The Roman Empire, which ruled their world with an iron fist, was a master of political theater, and the executions of subversives were carefully staged events that served as grim holiday viewing for the masses. The deaths of the apostles were designed to be as degrading and agonizing as possible, serving as a brutal reminder to the populace that defiance of imperial authority, especially in the name of a foreign, crucified king, would be met with total and excruciating destruction. Crucifixion, the preferred method for non-Roman citizens and slaves, was an incomprehensibly painful process of slow public asphyxiation and agony. drawn out over hours or days under the scorching sun, ensuring maximum visibility of the victim's suffering. The apostle would be left to gasp their last breath in front of mocking crowds, stripped of all dignity. Other apostles met equally brutal ends, often personalized to inflict maximum horror or shame. Tradition recounts James, the brother of John, was one of the first to go, beheaded by Herod Agrippa. A swift but decisive act of political assassination intended to appease local Jewish authorities and decapitate the nascent leadership. Peter, eventually captured in Rome, desiring not to die in the same manner as his teacher, was allegedly crucified upside down, only reinforcing the grotesque and inverted nature of the penalty, a concession to pride that did nothing to lessen the pain. Bartholomew was flayed alive, his skin ripped from his body, an agonizing process reserved for the worst offenders. Thomas was pierced with spears, and others were stoned, dragged, or burned. These deaths were not accidents or skirmishes. They were state-sponsored acts of maximum violence and judicial cruelty, intended to send an unambiguous message. For the apostles, the constant knowledge of this inevitable end compounded the psychological stress of their entire lives. They preached a message of eternal life and resurrection, while constantly staring down the absolute certainty of a painful, premature physical death. Every imprisonment, every flogging, and every mob encounter was merely a dress rehearsal for the final, catastrophic performance. The stress lay not just in the eventual pain, but in the waiting, the anticipation, and the knowledge that every day they survived was simply another day, delaying the inescapable appointment with the executioner. They had to teach hope while their own future was guaranteed hopelessness. Their deaths were deliberately devoid of glory or honor in the eyes of the empire. Roman authorities did not recognize them as legitimate political threats or noble martyrs. They were disposed of as common criminals, heretics, or street agitators, their bodies treated with contempt and often left as carrion or mutilated to ensure no sacred relics could be created. The Roman objective was not just to kill the man, but to utterly obliterate the legacy, preventing the establishment of a memorial or a rallying point for the remaining believers. They were removed from the census and erased from the public record. The executioner's payment, therefore, was a final, horrifying act of degradation that served to reinforce the total failure of the apostolic life from an earthly perspective. They had abandoned their careers, surrendered their wealth, and now had their lives extinguished in the most shameful manner imaginable. They paid the highest cost for a mission that offered zero earthly returns and ended in total human devastation. This violent erasure of their physical presence naturally led to the final logistical problem of their existence, the burial problem and the struggle for a lasting, tangible legacy in a world that sought to forget them entirely. Following the brutal conclusion of their lives, the next misery was the utter lack of a physical trace. The profound burial problem that ensured the apostles were denied the basic human dignity of a recognized resting place. This segment explores the historical reality that their bodies were often mutilated, dumped, or interred in unmarked graves, ensuring no monuments or pilgrimage sites could be immediately created. The focus is on the utter lack of earthly glory for men who had fundamentally changed the human narrative forever. In the ancient world, A proper burial was the final mark of respect, a necessary rite for the soul's journey, and the only way for the family to preserve a physical legacy for future generations. The apostles were systematically denied this closure. Because they were executed as state criminals and religious subversives, their bodies were typically handled according to the dictates of Roman law, which often involved simple, unceremonious disposal intended to inflict maximum ignominy. Their remains were viewed as politically toxic waste, and the authorities took pains to prevent their followers from turning their graves into shrines of defiance or centers of seditious assembly. The bodies of the crucified, for instance, were sometimes left on the cross to be consumed by birds and wild animals, a final, public act of shaming and contempt. If they were taken down, the remains were frequently mutilated or disposed of anonymously in common burial pits outside the city walls, known as pudiculi. This calculated move by the authorities was designed to deny the emerging faith a tangible locus of memory. Without a known tomb, there could be no immediate pilgrimage, no monument to defy the emperor, and no physical proof of their sacrifice beyond the fragile, easily suppressed word-of-mouth testimony of their followers. This absence of physical legacy was a deliberate and heavy part of the apostles' contract. They had signed up for a life that would end not just in poverty, but in absolute anonymity, a total erasure of their physical footprint. Unlike victorious generals who received triumphal arches and perpetual honors, or emperors whose names were carved on every corner of the empire, the apostles left behind no medals, no monuments, and no name on a stone. Their earthly legacy was literally nothingness, confirming their spiritual commitment to a kingdom not of this world, but also robbing their disciples of a concrete place to mourn and draw strength. For the surviving followers, this burial problem introduced a severe logistical and spiritual crisis. How do you honor the founder of your faith when you don't even know where he lies? The followers were forced to risk life and limb to secretly recover and interrust the remains, often settling for discreet, clandestine burials that had to be kept secret for decades, passing down the location of a supposed tomb through hushed whispers. This meant that the places where the apostles rested were often hidden, whispered secrets passed down through a traumatized community, rather than public, celebrated locations. The tradition that Peter and Paul were buried near Rome only survived due to the intense, clandestine loyalty of the early Roman Church, who essentially hid the memory of their graves until it was safe to reveal them centuries later. The result was an almost total disconnect between the apostles' immense historical influence and their material trace. Their legacy could not be anchored to a physical spot. It had to live entirely in the written word and the spiritual community of the church. This total lack of earthly glory, this forced, absolute anonymity, demanded that the final assessment of their lives pivot entirely away from the physical world and focus instead on the endurance of the message they delivered, the very message that cost them everything. This necessity of relying solely on the message for endurance leads to the final contemplation of their failure to quit. The final contemplation of the apostolic contract focuses on the grim reality of their non-retirement plan. The 25th and concluding point of their miserable existence is that they simply didn't get one. Their work only ended with their death, and their enduring historical impact rests entirely upon their complete and utter failure to quit. This chapter summarizes the brutal realities, noting that despite the complete lack of reward, security, or comfort, their refusal to walk away is what ultimately changed the course of human history. For the apostles, there was no notion of stepping back, handing over the reins, or retiring to the quiet countryside to live out their final years in peace with the financial cushion of a lifetime of service. Their profession was not one that permitted resignation. The penalty for leaving was exactly the same as the penalty for continuing: imprisonment and a violent death, but without the accompanying belief in an eternal reward. They were trapped in a lifetime commitment that only the executioner or a terminal illness could sever. The psychological difficulty of knowing that there was literally no safe exit, no point at which the pressure would ease, was a constant, exhausting feature of their lives. They were always running toward their end, knowing the finish line was a Roman sword or a cross. Their journey was a relentless, decades-long gauntlet of adversity that never once paused for rest or comfort. We have chronicled the economic suicide of their recruitment, which instantly plunged them into beggary and dependency. We detailed the linguistic and logistical nightmares of communication, where every letter was a death risk and every sermon risked misunderstanding. We explored the constant physical pursuit by Roman law, the claustrophobia of their prisons, the trauma of internal betrayal, and the agonizing guilt of self-doubt and familial abandonment. They were perpetually hungry, chronically exhausted, always watched, and repeatedly subjected to violent public degradation. Every day was an existential risk managed by sheer will. Despite this unbroken chain of misery, their failure to quit stands as the single most revolutionary act of their lives. For men who were low status, uneducated, and easily replaced, men who were terrified, flawed, and prone to error, their sheer obstinacy was inexplicable by any earthly calculation. They had every reason to return to their boats or tax booths. The Roman authorities would have gladly welcomed them back into obscurity. They had every opportunity to denounce the mission under torture, and every incentive to simply disappear into the vastness of the Roman Empire and assume a new, quiet identity far from the volatility of Judea. Yet, they did not. Their enduring pursuit of the faith, even in the face of inevitable, brutal martyrdom, fundamentally altered the world. It was their collective refusal to accept the finality of their earthly contract that gave the early church its indestructible foundation. The success of the mission did not come from a sudden shower of wealth, political power, or military triumph. It came from the agonizing, day-to-day resilience of men who chose to suffer rather than surrender, who prioritized a spiritual mandate over all physical comforts and necessities. The entire narrative of the apostles, therefore, is a testament to the power of commitment over comfort. They were guaranteed zero earthly reward, zero security, and zero peace. Yet their failure to quit, their total embrace of the miserable contract, resulted in a legacy that outlasted the empire that tried to crush them. They achieved the impossible not through ease, but through enduring the precise opposite of every human need. They left behind no monuments, no empires, and no physical wealth, but they left behind a message that transformed human morality ethics, and history forever. Their final, violent deaths were simply the highest price paid for the most enduring success imaginable, bringing the brutal, truthful contract of the apostles full circle.